Well, it is noon, so I suppose we should get started. I guess it's officially afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I am pinch hitting for my colleague Heather Harris, who's out sick today. She usually introduces this series, Lunchtime Look series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Todd Tabutis. I'm director of the Art Museum, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's guest. Lunchtime Looks are a series of noontime lectures like this. They're not totally lectures. They're supposed to be more conversation, discussion. And we invite folks from both the campus and the community who have different perspectives on our collection. So today, we'll learn more about Blanche Lazzel as it relates to the WPA. I just want to have a brief note that because we are recording this for our YouTube channel, this isn't live, but at the end I will be repeating questions so that they can be recorded and saved for posterity forever. So today we have with us Elizabeth Satterfield. Elizabeth is Curator and Director of Education at Arthurdale Heritage in Arthurdale, West Virginia. She has degrees from West Virginia University in Public Administration and Public History, and she has a keen interest in preserving and saving things that represent us and who we've been as much as we do here, especially the legacy of Blanche Lazzel. So we're all standing in front of this fantastic mural that Blanche had done, which is called Justice. This actually hung in the Monongalia County Courthouse behind the bench for many years, and we are the proud stewards of it today. So we are happy that Elizabeth has joined us from rainy Arthurdale, rainy everywhere now. So I don't want to slow it down anymore, so please join me in welcoming Elizabeth.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Do I need to do anything or I'm good? Okay, cool. Good afternoon. Thank you, Todd, for the generous introduction. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here and lots of new faces, friends I haven't met yet. And I'm excited to talk to you today about the intersection of public art and public history, specifically through the lens of the New Deal. Most of us in this room are likely familiar with public art. We've seen murals on the sides of buildings, sculptures in town squares, paintings hung in libraries or government buildings. Public art is simply art that's accessible to the public, whether in an indoor or outdoor setting. As art historian Mary Jane Jacob wrote in 1992, public art brings art closer to life. Public art often, but not always, tells a story about a specific place, person, or event. Public art's often created in collaboration with or in discussion with the local community, making the piece more personal and significant to that location. Here in Morgantown, you can walk downtown and see numerous pieces of public art, from the statue of Don Knotts in front of the Met Theater, to the Coca-Cola mural on the side of High Street, on High Street, to utility boxes on corners wrapped in contemporary artwork, to the mural that's pictured here on the screen, titled Ways of Caring, which depicts the rich multicultural heritage of Morgantown. Although these pieces can be understood by the general public, anybody who walks downtown can get something from these pieces, they are most meaningful to local residents who are intimately aware of and connected to Morgantown's history and culture. While public art is familiar to many people, public history is perhaps less known. Does anybody here hear the term public history and think of anything specific? When you hear public history, you can answer.
National landmarks.
Sure, national landmarks, preservation, anything else? Museums, artifacts, interpretation. When I was in graduate school studying public history, countless people asked me, so what is public history anyway? Or more importantly, they asked me, what are you going to do with this degree? These are very fair questions. Public history is a term that we don't hear every day in everyday vocabulary, but simply put, public history has the same foundational goal as public art, to make something, in this case history, accessible to the public. So whether you realize it or not, you interact with public history on a regular basis. Those roadside historical markers you see, interpretive signage along a trail, a guided tour at a historic site, captions next to artifacts in a museum, and historical documentaries are all examples of public history. Public historians like myself aim to translate the academic study of history into a format that the general public can absorb and appreciate. And like public art, this discipline requires a great deal of creativity and community involvement to be successful. Public art and public history are not mutually exclusive, though. Often one inspires or informs the other. The New Deal, both in its art and its rich history with which we're left today, is an excellent example of the intersection of public art and public history. If you can go to the next slide. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, the effects were felt worldwide. Pictured here, out-of-work miners in Purseglove, one of the company towns along Scott's Run, just a few miles from where we're sitting today. Although we often think of unemployed industrial workers or the Dust Bowl of the Midwest when we think about the Great Depression, it really impacted every sector of society, including the fine arts. Artists, like any other profession in the nation, were out of work and down on their luck. In a campaign speech on July 2nd, 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt vowed that quote says, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. But as President Roosevelt and his staff planned work relief programs during his first 100 days of office in 1933, they questioned if artists should be among the beneficiaries or not, which is a very interesting question. They considered leaving artists completely out of the work relief programs. Harry Hopkins, who was head of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration at the time, which was one of the first relief administrations of the New Deal, said, quote, that artists have got to eat just like other people. So during the course of the New Deal, as FDR's groundbreaking legislation would become known, the federal government ended up administering 4 separate art projects. So I want to talk a little bit about those before we jump into talking about Blanche Lazzel's piece. The Public Works of Art Project, which is sometimes called the PWAP, was the first of these projects and was established in 1934. In its first 4 months of existence alone, the Public Works of Art Project hired 3,749 artists who produced 15,663 pieces of art. Even for government standards in the 1930s, this was a pretty quick turnaround. The government spent an average cost of only $75 per artwork, which is a sweet deal even at that time. Artists were recruited from all over the country and had to pass a rigorous test to prove they were professional artists. From urban scenes to coal mines to lumber mills to farms to historical events, these artists produced works of art that were generally conservative in form and depicted what they called the American scene for all the nation to see. If you go to the next slide, following the Public Works of Art Project, and I'll talk about this piece in just a moment, the federal government established 3 additional art projects during the New Deal. So the Public Works of Art Project kind of came and went, and then the WPA and some other ones ended up becoming established. In both scope and employment, the Federal Art Project under the Works Progress Administration was the largest of all the New Deal art projects. You might be familiar with the Works Progress Administration in that they built a lot of roads. The stone walls we see here in Morgantown were built by the WPA. Borman Hall on the downtown campus was a WPA project. A lot of school buildings and federal buildings were built during the WPA, but they also had this Federal Art Project as part of it. Most artists employed with WPA and other New Deal art projects never gained notoriety and are today's obscure references. But for others, it was the first step in their successful careers. Jackson Pollock is probably the most famous. He and his wife, Lee Krasner, for example, both spent 8 years working for the WPA. Additionally, African American and Native American artists were hired to depict their unique histories and cultures. Numerous artists emerged from the Harlem Renaissance to produce pieces for the WPA, including Aaron Douglas, who created this piece. It's titled Aspects of Negro Life. It was a 4-panel mural that hung, and I believe still hangs, in the New York Public Library in Harlem. Interestingly, the Treasury Department was the other agency that supervised art projects during the New Deal, and this was specifically to put art in federal buildings. The Treasury Relief Art Project and the section of Fine Arts were those 2 departments. I'm going to talk more about the section. It was just nicknamed the section, and this project commissioned artists to create pieces for public buildings. Located in nearly every community across the nation, both big and small, rich and poor, post offices were the common setting for the section's works of art. Hundreds of new post offices were constructed as part of the New Deal, and roughly 1% of funds was to be set aside to pay artists to commission pieces to put in these post offices. Artists were selected through a competitive process, and then once awarded a commission, it was impressed upon them that the communities were their true patrons, not the government, but the communities. So the artists often worked closely with town members and the local postmaster and other federal entities to create these masterpieces. But despite the ongoing economic struggles and industrial woes across the country, murals and other works of art created during the New Deal often depicted a very idealized portrayal of America, and it was very celebratory and focused often on local history. This regionalism represented local everyday life, often in rural locations. It was criticized as propaganda at the time, but the Roosevelt administration wanted to emphasize an optimistic and hopeful view of America, hoping to show a strong, recovering country focused on the working class and technological advancements. And art was the perfect medium in which to deliver this message to the nation, and Blanche Lazzel was one such artist to participate. Born in Monongalia County in 1878, Blanche Lazzel was a prolific early modernist artist. Lazzel graduated from West Virginia University with a degree in fine arts in 1905, then enrolled in the Art Students League in New York City. She went on to study in Paris and was deeply influenced by abstraction and cubism. Returning to the United States, Lazzel settled in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which was a burgeoning arts community at the time, and became a leading figure in white-line woodblock printmaking. Between 1916 and 1956, Lazzel created more than 138 blocks, each carefully carved by hand with a knife, then meticulously used to create prints. During the winter of 1933 to 34, however, Lazzel returned to Morgantown and participated in the Public Works of Art project, that first early federal project. And if you can go to the next slide, she created 3 woodblock prints of historic sites in Morgantown. One was a view from Seneca Hill, kind of the Sunnyside area looking down towards the river. The second was this one, which is titled The Campus of West Virginia University. And the last one was the home of Waitman T. Willie, who was a founding figure in West Virginia statehood, and his home's over in the Chancery Hill neighborhood. These works of art are among the most modernistic and abstract pieces created under the Public Works of Art project, but ironically, they are among the least abstract pieces produced by Lazzel during her storied career. So the federal government really was against like kind of European and modernist movements in the federal artwork they had produced, and the pieces Lazzel made were some of the most modernist. But on the other hand, if you look at her entire repertoire of pieces that she made during her career, they are some of the more realistic and like traditional pieces she made. Project administrators and local judge Charles Baker were so impressed with works like this one that they asked Lazzel to create a public mural to display behind the circuit courts bench in the Monongalia Courthouse, which is what you can see behind me today. Inspired by iconic buildings in Morgantown, Lazzel created this piece titled Justice. She chose to depict 3 sectors of society in this mural. WVU Stewart Hall is seen to the far left. It was the library at the time. Today it's administration offices, and this represented education and science. The central building is the First Methodist Episcopal Church, which is today Wesley United Methodist, at the top of High Street, and this represented religion. And the smokestacks to the far right were to represent the Morgantown Glass Works and the Morgantown Brick Company, which you know where the Seneca Center is today. That's where these were located. And this represented industry and work. Juxtaposing the stark urban industrial foreground is the softer, more pastoral scene in the back, which features Lazell's family farm. You can see it very small there behind the peak of Stewart Hall. And the scales of justice hang above the entire county, carefully balancing between these 3 sectors of society that she depicts in the composition. Unique among her pieces, created for the Public Works of Art project, Lazzel wrote a poem in May 1934 after completing this piece to accompany it. And I just wanted to read it to you all today. It's also printed here, so you can read it yourself after I'm done speaking, but I wanted to read it aloud to you. She writes, "The courtroom is cleared, the jury gone. The prisoner has returned to his cell, the artist alone remains. Silence, silence everywhere. Even the street traffic has ceased to rumble. The sky is clouded, a storm approaches. After days of heat, the tender leaves tremble in the stillness. The new that have never felt the touch of rain, nor heard the crash of thunder, nor seen the flash of lightning, tremble and wait. Their first approaching cloud. The artist alone in the silent hall slowly wields her brush upon a giant canvas. Slowly and silently emerges her sense of justice, science, religion, work, united in harmonious form and color, and the river flowing between the green hills beyond expresses peace. Above all hangs the balance, justice." Lazell's mural is one of the many pieces of art created for public buildings in West Virginia during the New Deal. Numerous post offices and government buildings around the Mountain State hosted New Deal public art projects. Many pieces in West Virginia, as you would expect, depicted the coal or timber industries or rural scenes and other celebrated historical events. If you go to the next slide, another piece here in Morgantown depicts the mineral industries, and this is a mural that hangs in Whitehall in the large auditorium behind, at the front of the room. This was completed in 1942 by Pittsburgh artist Robert Louis Lepper, and it aimed to express a unity between art and science. Technology and industry are readily apparent as the centerpiece of the mural. So this goes back to the government's idea, the federal government's idea of progress, modernism, anything to show that there's hope for the country as we struggle through the Depression. Unfortunately, we do not know the fate of many New Deal artworks. Since the 1930s, detail records have not been retained, or they may not have existed to begin with. Research has been conducted to ascertain the whereabouts of many New Deal pieces, but some have just been lost to time, perhaps falling out of fashion and being taken down for public display. Beginning as early as 1934, the federal government started moving the pieces around and loaning and allocating artworks to public agencies and nonprofits. So at the very beginning, they start moving things around and then not keeping good records. Today, the Government Services Administration, the GSA, is who's responsible for all these loaned artworks, and they've located 20,000 pieces so far. Lazzel's Justice itself, this is a good example, was removed from the courthouse in the 1970s and then placed in storage in the basements of the courthouse and public library before it came back to WVU, and then it's been recently restored, and now we have it back on public display. So this piece is very lucky to have been saved and to now be on display. Again, there are many pieces that this is not the fate. There's probably a lot more in basements around the nation. Many pieces, however, are still on display in public buildings. Researchers have located 17 pieces that are still here in West Virginia. 16 are in post offices, and 1 is in the U.S. Forest Service building in Elkins. Many of these pieces are similar in style and subject matter, but they were all completed by different artists who utilized a variety of media, from tempera to oil on canvas, and then murals directly on walls. There were also some sculptors who were involved, and they created sculptures and reliefs made of glazed terracotta, plaster of Paris, and wood. If you're interested in learning more about these pieces that are still on public display, there's an online tour on Clio, which is a kind of like a historical Yelp. I don't know what's a better way to describe it. It's a project out of Marshall University, but they have an online tour called New Deal Post Offices and Art in West Virginia, so I would encourage you to go there if you're interested in learning more. But I just want to talk about 3 pieces today. The first, if you can go to the next slide, is located in Canova. This sculpture, which is simply titled Worker, is located in the Canova Post Office, which is outside of Huntington. The post office was constructed in 1939 by the WPA, and funds were set aside to commission these carved wood reliefs by Albino Cavallito. Cavallito was a well-known sculptor who studied at the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design in New York City, and he created these pieces at the height of his career. The central figure is a shirtless male with a large sledge at his side. He is surrounded by 4 smaller vignette panels that depict agriculture, timber, mining, and industry. And this sculpture really celebrates the American worker and the contributions of the working class to West Virginia. It doesn't talk about, there's no confrontation of any of the issues with these industries. We all know that there's problems with the mining industry, with the timber industry, and just industry in general. And we know that there is problems with agriculture at the time, but they don't confront these issues. Instead, it's more celebratory and just tries to depict the American worker in kind of more of a heroic form. The next piece I want to talk about is in Fayetteville. Built in 1938 through the WPA, the interior of the Fayetteville Post Office still displays this oil on canvas piece titled The Miners. This piece was the most famous of all the works of Nicksford Baldwin, who was the painter, and he completed several pieces for the WPA. He was strongly influenced by Mexican muralism, and you can see the strong outlines and the muted color palette in this piece. The mural depicts the coal industry, which was the main industry in Fayetteville for decades. The mural does not directly, just like the last piece, does not directly confront the negative impacts or dangers of the coal industry, but instead highlights the hard work of coal miners and the support the industry provided to families. As you can see, there's a father and daughter walking hand in hand. There's a dog kind of following behind. It's a more hopeful and happy piece than what you might actually see if you were to go to a coal town in the 1930s. And the last piece I want to talk about, if you can go to the next one, is one of 2 murals that hangs in the U.S. Forest Service building in Elkins. This piece was, the Forest Service building was constructed by the WPA between 1936 and 38. There were 2 murals. I only selected one today. The first one, which I did not depict here, was a Forest Service tower, and it just says the words "help prevent fires" at the base of the tower. Very simple message, and it's more focused on what you can do as an individual to prevent wildfires. The second piece, which is directly across the lobby from the fire tower piece, is this one, titled Mining Village. This piece was completed by Stephen DeHanos, one of the most prolific artists of the New Deal. It's more realistic in style than other WPA pieces and confronts the dark realities of the industry. You can see kind of a school situated directly in between probably what's a busy railroad and a coal mine in the back. There's a dead tree in the foreground. They're identical gray homes on a hillside that's completely been denuded. And there's the haunting stare of the miner and the foreground. So this is more of a sobering piece. It was actually created to be hung in the Huntington post office, and they rejected it. And then they tried to give it to a post office in Logan, and they rejected it because it was deemed too depressing, and it eventually ended up at the U.S. Forest Service building, where far fewer people would see it. The Forest Service building is not like a post office where people come and go on a daily basis. So these pieces still hang in the forest headquarters in Elkins. But our projects were just one aspect of President Roosevelt's New Deal. The New Deal gave birth to numerous agencies, which we often call alphabet soup agencies today. There was the WPA, the CCC, the TVA, the NIRA, the FERA, the NYA. There's a whole list of them. If you go online, there's at least 50 agencies. Some of them were short-lived, and then others, like the Social Security Administration, probably the most famous, still exists today. These new agencies were tasked with addressing pressing socioeconomic issues around the country, like unemployment and poverty, as well as environmental issues like drought and deforestation. In addition to providing much-needed jobs, these agencies improved and built infrastructure, including roads, bridges, water systems, electrification programs, and much more. The WPA built a lot of the roads that we use here still in West Virginia. Most of the roads were completely unimproved in the 1930s, so it wasn't until this infusion of federal dollars that we actually had usable roads in much of West Virginia. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which is one of my favorite agencies, engaged young men to deal with environmental issues, namely deforestation and erosion. In West Virginia, the CCC boasted 65 camps and more than 55,000 participants during its time. Many of the beautiful forested areas in state and national forests that we have today in West Virginia are a direct result of the CCC. And like I said, many of the roads, bridges, and government buildings that we still use today in West Virginia were part of the New Deal, namely through the Works Progress Administration. One of the most creative and experimental programs of the New Deal was the Subsistence Homestead Division, which changed names a few different times, but it was called the Resettlement Administration for a while, and then it became the Farm Security Administration. It changed agencies, it moved around. But this was founded very early in President Roosevelt's administration in '33 and focused on relocating impoverished out-of-work families to rural locations where they could farm and live a subsistence lifestyle. And the first of these experimental communities was just 20 miles from here. And that was Arthurdale. So if you can go to the next slide. Arthurdale, which was known as the Reedsville experiment at the time, consisted of 165 individual homesteads, complete with a modern home, barn, and outbuildings, and then you had acreage to farm. More than 1,000 families applied to move to Arthurdale, but ultimately 165 families were chosen. And many of these came from the Scotts Run area, which we saw earlier, the picture in Purse-Glove, that's in the Scotts Run area. The men came first to help build the roads and houses, followed by their wives and children's. The homes were incredibly modern for the time. They were fully electrified, equipped with indoor plumbing, furnished with furniture made on site. They even had refrigerators, so they were kind of almost luxurious for the 1930s, especially in a rural area like Arthurdale. Arthurdale was the pet project of Eleanor Roosevelt, and she visited more than 30 times during her husband's administration. She was deeply involved in the planning and implementation of the project and remained close with the homesteader families for years to come. She came for square dances, she picked out the refrigerators that went in their houses, she scrutinized budgets, she gave Christmas gifts to children every year. She was very involved in this project, more so than any First Lady has been in any federal project. Public art was not directly included in the Arthurdale project, but many themes and elements of the New Deal can be found in Arthurdale's story. New Deal public art was meant to inspire the nation and tell stories of progress, strength, and hope. And in many ways, the intent of Arthurdale was the same. As the first of 99 homestead communities across the country, Arthurdale was meant to be a model of modernity and subsistence for the rest of the nation. It was supposed to be the physical embodiment of the idyllic murals that hung in these post offices, a picture of what the New Deal could accomplish and what rural America looked like if we work cooperatively, kind of get back to our agrarian roots. And very stark contrast to the photographs taken of the impoverished coal camps along Scotts Run, like we saw at the beginning of the presentation. The photographs taken of Arthurdale, and all of these were taken by federal photographers, by the way. They were just like the artists and New Deal, they hired photographers as well. The photographs of Arthurdale, all of them we see really capture an industrious and prosperous and very tidy community with little houses all in a row, perfectly white, yards maintained. So it really was to be in contrast to the poverty that was also photographed at the time. So while Arthurdale did lift 165 families out of poverty and provided social and education opportunities they would not have had otherwise, there were substantial challenges related to industry and economics in the project, as well as tension between homesteaders and the federal government, which is not surprising. Who could imagine that we might have conflict with one another or conflict with the government? But the children of those original homesteaders, they likened moving to Arthurdale as like stepping into paradise. However, we now know that the project was far from perfect, and it's been heavily criticized by economists and historians as an economic failure. But if you talk to anybody who grew up there, anybody who moved there, it was really a huge success, especially socially and culturally. Although the CCC and WPA both operated in Arthurdale for a short time, federal art was never really incorporated into the community. However, I brought a piece today that a WPA artist created that was ultimately loaned to Glenn Work, who was the community manager of Arthurdale. This piece, which I'll hold up for everyone to see, was titled Autumn Landscape, and it hung in Work's home on Y Road, which overlooks the entire community. Stuart Eddy, or Edie, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, a Texas artist, created this piece in 1937 before it came to Arthurdale in May of 1938. Edie was a modernist painter and, like Blanche Lazzel, studied at the Art Students League in New York City. Edie completed several works of art through the New Deal programs, but we don't know much about this piece. I'm going to set it down briefly. Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. I'll give it to you.
Karen,
Thank you. Thank you, I appreciate it. This was actually left behind in Arthurdale after the project manager left, and was left in the house, and then the new owners of the house donated this piece to Arthurdale Heritage, so we have it hanging in our main office now, but we don't know much about it, unfortunately. It does have the original loan paperwork, which I'm going to pull out from behind. A little pocket. We have the original loan card of when it was sent to Arthurdale in May 18th of 1938. Stick that back in there. Thank you. You can set it back down if you want. If you want to switch to the next picture, just as in the New Deal, art can still be used today to convey, to tell stories and convey important messages. Historian Bob Beatty wrote in 2017 that art is a powerful way to connect with people. It is a potent weapon in our arsenal. Where public history may fall short or might seem stuffy, art is a way to connect with the great variety of people in the community who may not otherwise engage with history. Art can be used to shed new light and perspective on old or traditional topics, bringing renewed relevance to historic sites and museums. Art can also be used to interpret difficult or challenging histories like race, politics, or trauma. I know the Art Museum here has done several different exhibits that have touched on what might be difficult topics, but art's a way to get at it without being quite as in your face and confrontational. It's more subjective than history, which we consider to be a more objective study. And art allows us to step back from historical facts and figures, conveying a more humanistic connection and drawing on emotion. There have been many examples of art and public history working together. I'm not going to talk about all of them today. There's a really good book I can recommend about art and public history together with lots of case studies, but I'll just touch on a few things. Artifacts have been reinterpreted as works of art instead of just looking at it and saying, how was this piece used historically? You can look at it as a work of art and display it with new interpretation and new perspectives. And this allows us to dig a little bit deeper and sidestep obvious interpretation. Artist in residence programs. This has been popular recently. I went to a session at a conference last year where historic sites around the country are bringing artists on site who spend time there and engage with the history, end up producing pieces that they don't mimic the styles or the direct history of the site, but interpret it in a new way. And this engages a completely new audience that might not have ever visited the site otherwise. Art has also been used to illuminate historical narratives and connect to the power of place. There's a new exhibit in the Watson Museum, which is in the Mineral Resources Building here at WVU, which is titled Mineral Matters, and it's a really cool exhibit. It's been up since the fall, and it displays art related to the mineral industries of West Virginia. Many of the pieces make a statement about the problematic history of the extraction industries in the state. but quite a few others actually use the minerals in the composition. Like some of them use coal dust, or some of them have used like acid mine drainage to actually make these pieces. So if you haven't seen this exhibit, I would encourage you to check it out. I think it will be open for several more months this year before they switch to a new exhibit. Art can also be used in more simple ways to engage an audience. So this is a bunch of kids in our art class at Arthurdale. Our art classes, don't necessarily, we don't talk about the history of Arthurdale during our art classes, but we talk about art history. We get the kids actually on site. We get the parents on site. And these are audiences that we would never have had in Arthurdale otherwise. And they get to be in a historic location to do something with their hands. And historically, Arthurdale was known for hands-on experiential education, which was considered very progressive at the time. So doing things like kids' art classes and craft heritage classes, like weaving. We have an active weaving program. These are ways that we can connect back to history without you actually walking through a museum and getting a guided tour. People are still engaging with public history. So these are ways that we can all be creative and connect art and history together. That's all I have. I entertain questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. And I think for us as an art museum to have this larger context of what Lazzel was doing within the WPA and that sort of history here in West Virginia, I want to open it up to questions. Elizabeth said she would happily take some. And do you mind if I hand you the microphone? No.
As soon as I saw this, I was reminded of the big murals at Jackson's Mill in the Assembly Hall. And are you familiar with them?
I am familiar with those. There was that part of the World's Fair? If I don't know if anybody's more familiar with these. I don't believe those were New Deal, they weren't New Deal projects, were they? I don't think they were, but this, yeah, I think they were part of the World's Fair exhibition, but they are similar in style, yeah.
They're very impactful. I mean, I remember them as a kid. I just thought they were so awesome. And they do represent industry and agriculture, and they just were very interesting.
Yeah.
And this reminded me of them. I just wondered if there was any connection.
Yeah, that's a good connection to make.
I wonder, Elizabeth, when you, as a public historian and somebody who's thought about this a lot, what about the context for these works? Because I have to actually put myself in mind of if I'm in the courthouse,
Sure.
Why am I in the courthouse? What's my purpose?
Yeah.
Am I being arraigned? What's going on? And I'm looking at this, right? Like, have you thought a lot about the context of art in that
Yeah,
sort of
so
space?
I don't get to interact with art as much as some other public historians. We don't have a huge collection of art in our museum collection at Arthurdale, but a lot of other either history museums or art museums have kind of stepped away from like a general interpretation of a piece of art that says, when was it made, where was it located, who made it, a brief history of the piece, and talking more about the composition to having more contextual interpretation. And I think questions like, okay, where was it located, why was it there specifically, and what do each of these symbols mean, and what message was supposed to be conveyed. So art, public art, especially during this period, was, there was always a message, and it usually wasn't very subliminal. Like, they had a very clear message that they wanted to convey. And this, it's all about balance, and each of these sectors has to be balanced. And then I think also like a balance between like traditional, like agricultural, more rural life, and then this more urban industrial setting is part of it. But yeah, that's a really good point. And I've seen several exhibitions where they interpret the pieces of art as artifacts, not just as pieces of art. Yeah.
Well, and I would just think that the color palette to me would be a little bit more soothing if I were in a courtroom, perhaps, and it was a stressful situation. And if you're standing at the post office waiting, maybe that's a different kind of palette or something. But anyway, I'm offering my own opinion now. Is there any other questions for Elizabeth? Yes. You have to take the mic, Cindy.
I'm not sure this is a question,
Okay.
but in my vague memory, I remember a little flyer about public art in Morgantown,
Yes.
which was created by, was it a collaborative thing.
Yeah, you
So-
mean the public
A
art
little
tour
flyer.
that they had? There was a brochure with a map. Is that what you're talking, like fairly recently, or is this?
It's fairly recent.
Yeah.
It's a little trifold.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's also online. That's a good point.
Yeah.
It lists all the public art in Morgantown, and also some of it a little bit outside of town. Yeah, it's got a map and pictures. It's really good. I think WVU put it together a few years ago. Yeah.
Once I get this, I don't give it up. I would recommend highly the mosaics that Debbie Palmer has done communally. She's done them, and you've seen them around. There used to be one down at the waterfront. Now it's moved down. It has, speaking of community, she had people in the community make leaves, decorate leaves that represent different agencies, different organizations around town. And one that you may have harder time finding is in the Marilla Center. If you go in the Marilla Center, you have to go for an event, but the place looks like a museum, art museum, with these panels that were created for Point Marion. And so they are indicative. There's the bridge. Point Marion eventually couldn't have a place for it, I believe. So there may be 6 or 8 mosaics there. So I highly recommend that.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, that's
Appreciate
great,
it.
Cindy. It's a good point to say that this, to your point, this
Yeah.
is alive and well, and you don't know where you'll find them, right? They're kind of in front of us.
And if anybody would like to learn more about Arthurdale, I brought some brochures and newsletters. If anyone would like to learn more, I can give that to you afterwards. Just wanted to offer that.
Don't be shy. There are other opportunities. Well, if there are no other questions, I will wrap up by letting everybody know that the last Lunchtime Looks for the academic year that we will host is on April 14th, so not the first Friday because that is our spring holiday here at WVU, but the 14th at noon, and it's Dr. Elisa Di Bartolomeo who helped co-curate the exhibition behind you, In Humanity, Combat and Art, and so she will be here at noon on that day. And we are closed for spring break, but we are open Thursday through Sunday, 12:30 to 6. We are open for the rest of the day if you haven't been able to see the exhibitions upstairs or spend time here. And of course, I'm sure Elizabeth will be here for a few
Sure,
minutes to
absolutely.
talk if you have any questions. And with that, I guess we'll conclude. And thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah,
Join me in
thank
thanking you.